If we take the example of non-EU financial institutions, if a non-EU financial institution is added to this annex, the consequence is that anyone subject to EU law must comply with the transaction ban and so cannot engage in any transaction directly or indirectly with that non-EU financial institution. And so the result or the effect of that from the perspective of the non-EU bank is that essentially you lose access to the EU market.
You are listening to This Month in EU Sanctions, a podcast at the crossroads of EU law, business, and foreign policy. I am Jan Dunin-Wasowicz, your main host. In This Month in EU Sanctions, we'll discuss all things sanctions, export controls, and trade compliance from an EU perspective. In addition to a monthly selection of legal, regulatory, and policy updates, each episode will discuss a topic of particular interest or feature a conversation with a guest. At a time of great uncertainty, the podcast seeks to offer clear information and insights, bringing together people who make, practice, or study modern European security law.
Throughout the month of March 2025, European Union leaders continued to scramble to find the appropriate responses to a now three-dimensional policy challenge. First, the potential impending transatlantic trade war and general breakdown of the global trade system as we've known it for decades. Second, the future of the European Union's defense and security and the urgent calls for a massive ramp-up of defense spending, enhancing the European defense, technological, and industrial base. Third, the immediate risk of erosion of the coalition around the Russia sanctions amidst talks between the US and Russia over a potential ceasefire in Ukraine. While these three policy areas may at first seem unrelated or somewhat compartmentalized, in the recent weeks it became increasingly apparent that they bleed into another. All three called on EU leaders to find leverage. Leverage in the thinking about how to respond and potentially retaliate to US tariffs. Leverage to define terms of market participation in the awaited massive injection of public and private funds into the European Union defense industry. And leverage to use to the greatest possible effect EU sanctions against Russia to define and protect a just and lasting peace for Ukraine. The EU's potential leverage in sanctions became particularly apparent in the last few weeks. On March 6, the European Council adopted a position firmly supported by 26 heads of state or government, in which it noted, in relation to sanctions, that the EU remains committed, in coordination with like-minded partners and allies, to stepping up pressure on Russia, including through further sanctions and by strengthening the enforcement of existing measures in order to weaken its ability to continue waging its war of aggression. On March 12th, the European Parliament adopted a resolution calling, among other things, for additional sanctions against Russia. 2 days later, on March 14th, the Council of the European Union extended existing financial sanctions against Russia for another 6 months until 15th September 2025. Now, the Council did not renew the listings of 4 individuals and removed 3 deceased persons from the EU sanctions list. As a reminder, on January 27th, the Council had renewed the sectoral sanctions for a further 6 months until 31st July 2025. On March 20th, the European Council adopted another document, supported as well firmly by 26 heads of states or governments, noting again in relation to sanctions that the EU remains ready to step up pressure on Russia, including through further sanctions and by strengthening the enforcement of existing measures. And it added in this document that subject to EU law, Russia's assets should remain immobilized until Russia ceases its war of aggression against Ukraine and compensates it for the damage caused by this war. That was the message sent by the EU. Now, that resolve would be tested towards the end of the month. On March 25, 2025, following a meeting with US representatives in Saudi Arabia regarding a potential ceasefire, Russia published a readout calling for specific sanctions relief, identifying a number of measures and entities, such as a bank, that it wished to see removed from restrictions. While the US's position on this request remained unclear or ambiguous, 2 days later, concluding a meeting on peace and security for Ukraine held in Paris on March 27th, European leaders confirmed that they would not consider lifting sanctions at this time. EU leaders may find significant leverage in EU sanctions for at least 3 reasons. EU sanctions are a key element of financial sanctions, particularly regarding SWIFT. They have been very impactful on bilateral trade. Actually, one of the reasons the US administration put forth to explain the relatively low new tariffs on Russia is that there isn't much trade between the US and Russia, and most of Russia's immobilized assets, those of the Russian Central Bank, are located in the European Union. The question now becomes whether and how EU leaders will manage this leverage from an external perspective regarding the US and Russia, among others. The EU also needs to navigate its internal dynamics, especially as regards Hungary. In the meantime, the EU is reportedly working on a 17th package of sanctions and planning to manage the next discussions regarding the renewal of current measures in July. If the US reduces its sanctions pressure on Russia and the EU stays the course, companies will have to navigate, as I mentioned in the first episode following the adoption of the 16th package, a new compliance landscape. Russia wasn't the only issue that the EU addressed from a sanctions perspective. In March 2025, the EU took several other actions, including concerning the Democratic Republic of Congo and Belarus. The European Union rolled out new compliance resources, beginning with a brand new EU Sanctions Help Desk that aims to support small and medium enterprises with sanctions compliance. The March edition of the newsletter covers these developments. I am thrilled to welcome our next guests, Jeff Nielsen and Gonzalo Saiz. Jeff is a sanctions and export controls lawyer who has practiced in law firms and in-house in the United States and Denmark. With more than 20 years' experience in this space, his work focuses on both US and EU sanctions and export controls. Prior to law practice, Jeff worked as a foreign policy advisor in the United States Congress. Jeff is the author of the blog This Week in Sanctions. Gonzalo is a research fellow at the Center for Finance and Security at the Royal United Services Institute in London, focusing on sanctions and counter-threat finance. His research touches on sanctions implementation, circumvention and evasion tactics, as well as sanctions enforcement. Among other projects, Gonzalo leads the European Sanctions and Illicit Finance Monitoring and Analysis Network, also called SIFMANET.
Jeff, Gonzalo, and I recently co-authored an article titled Beyond the Secondary Sanctions Debate, the Rise of Ancillary Listings in EU Sanctions, which was published by EU Law Live in the March 2025 weekend edition. I greatly enjoyed discussing our research with Jeff and Gonzalo and catching up on the most recent developments in the EU's sanctioning activity in this new age of EU sanctions. Well, Jeff, Gonzalo, welcome to the program and thank you so much for joining.
Thanks very much for having us.
Hi, Jan. Hi, Jeff. Good to see you.
So the three of us embarked on a research and writing project a few months ago. Why did we write this article?
The reason for writing the article, it derives primarily from my observation, and I think you two would agree, that the Russian war and the sanctions related to the war imposed by the European Union, the practice that evolved in EU listings, reflected that the risk or the challenge to the European Union's security and their foreign policy was existential. So designations, or what we call in EU practice parlance, listings, began to evidence that the Council was targeting entities that were not only Russian. And I think this reflects the EU's recognition that its foreign policy objectives extend beyond just what's going on in Ukraine and their big neighbor next door to them, Russia. Other entities in Iran, China, North Korea, and other countries are stepping in to help the Russians. And as I observed this, I began to see that in designation or listing authorities, the EU began to use these types of authorities that clearly look a lot akin to U.S. secondary sanctions. And therefore, I think there was a need to create or conceptualize a legal doctrinal framework around this, because it doesn't exist yet in the European Union. And the second reason I think for writing the paper ties to that, and that is that the debate about what secondary sanctions are has been very fraught with, in my opinion, a lot of misunderstanding. And so the paper is intended to properly couch secondary sanctions and then to look at EU practice and create recommend a doctrinal framework around that practice in the context of what we now call ancillary listings.
If you're going to sanction a target, then you have to acknowledge that it's going to be supported by others in third countries. If our sanctions toolkit is not helping us reach them and stopping the flow of material and financial support to all these countries, to the target of primary sanctions, then that regime will ultimately fail. Now that sanctions are happening in a what we call unilateral or autonomous manner, they're not taking place at the UN level, the EU has to overcome that, the fact that it has less allies in the world implementing the sanctions, and drive this further.
I think the original impetus for this paper was, in fact, I intended that we would write a paper just saying secondary sanctions aren't as broad as people think they are, and leave it at that. But of course, then our research took us down this very good rabbit hole into what we found in EU practice, and it fleshed out the paper even more. A significant amount of the large plurality, if not the majority of legal academic work on secondary sanctions, reaches the flawed conclusion that secondary sanctions are broader than what they really are. And in that regard, there are two pillars. First, the prototypical secondary sanctions as defined by the U.S. government in FAQs and guidance and in case authority is that secondary sanctions are simply the bad guys that help the bad guys, for lack of a more defined term, specific term. But effectively, this means that these are entities, persons who engage in conduct that either provide material support or assistance to, or who engage in significant transactions with the designated targets or the targets that are the subject of the primary sanctions regime. However, in the conflated arguments that are made, the authors conflate, in my opinion, wrongly, the extraterritorial prescriptive jurisdiction applied to sanctions. And what do I mean by this? Here I mean when the U.S., for example, initiates an enforcement action, whether it be criminal or civil, against a non-U.S. company for causing a violation of U.S. sanctions. And these arguments conflate these two as one.
What happens when there's an action by the U.S. in the complete absence of U.S. nexus? So suppose a sanctions action by the U.S. government over a transaction between two non-U.S. persons, not using any goods or items subject to U.S. jurisdiction, not using the U.S. dollar, but still caught by the U.S.'s sanctions activity. So this type of scenario, I think for many people in the EU, for some time,
was often seen as an excessive or an outreach on the part of U.S. jurisdiction over conduct and transactions that didn't have any nexus or connections to the U.S.
It's important to understand that the action that you spoke about broadly and EU distaste for U.S. action that has no ostensible territorial nexus has to be defined more clearly. And I see this a lot in parlance and discussion here. In the context of action, you have two kinds. The U.S. can either designate, under U.S. law, it's called designation. In the EU, it's called listing. Designate a party, i.e. sanction it for activity that the U.S. finds in violation or inconsistent with U.S. foreign policy and consistent with the listing authorities in the sanctions regulations, or action can mean taking an enforcement against that party or parties. And in that regard, under U.S. law, both administrative law or criminal law, in order to have the ability to penalize someone, there must be venue in the United States. And to have venue in the United States, you must have U.S. jurisdiction. And in order to have U.S. jurisdiction in sanctions parlance, commonly spoken, this means, as you brought up, Jan, you have to either have U.S. items involved. You have to have some kind of a U.S. hook. The banking one, of course, is the biggest one we see in enforcement and sanctions. People moving money through the U.S. correspondent banking system is a basis.
Great. And I think in light of the activity throughout the various rounds and packages, and I think that's also what prompted the interest and the desire to look at this a bit more from an academic perspective. The EU did two things. It seems it first introduced instruments, and then it started using or not using those instruments, right? So we're on the one hand looking at the evolution of the toolbox, and we're also looking at the practice. And so, Gonzalo, Jeff, when we start looking at the toolbox, when it comes to the sanctioning authority and the various instruments that were introduced since 2022, what do we find in that toolbox? How would we present that in general terms first, and maybe we can then discuss the practice and what we make of it from a conceptual perspective?
That's the foundational part of this paper, where we try to identify the powers that the EU has been expanding, and in order to pursue this now more ambitious mission. And we can find it in its one of the key regulations in the Russia program, which is Council Regulation 269/2014. And specifically, the EU lists its designation criteria under Article 3. Throughout the packages since February 2022, this article has been expanding with the rest of the regulation. The regulation lays out primarily the financial restrictions and the targeting that can be imposed. So we find that, and we can explore this through different ancillary listings that we adopt in this paper, how the EU started not only going after Russian actors and Russian entities and entities based in Russia, but also individuals and entities abroad that were, in the words of the EU, supporting materially or financially the actions that undermine or threaten the territorial integrity of Ukraine, those benefiting or supporting Russian decision makers and the government of Russia. And then we have seen, as different priority areas emerge, the targeting of those not only owning vessels in the shadow fleet, now one of the hottest topics in the sanctions debate, but also those that provide material and financial support to the operation of these vessels. So we have seen how the EU has been introducing authorities in order to go after these bad guys that are supporting Russia, not just the very primary target.
And then the listing authority that you mentioned, Gonzalo, under Article 3 of Regulation 269, which is now very broad, I think it's important to remind that the consequence of the listing under this provision are full blocking sanctions.
If we look at Article 3, 269's various designation authorities, there are multiple. And in that, there are two of our four subcategories. The first are what we call direct ancillary listings. And these are most similar to U.S. prototypical secondary sanctions. So in this case, you've got, as you mentioned, full asset blocking, economic resource deprivation sanctions, designations. And in this regard, no nexus to the European Union is required. And here we found Belarusians, Iranians, Chinese, North Korean, and Syrians all designated in the regulation, under the regulations authorities for providing material support. And that term is used along with some other words in the various subcategories. And the second category that you find within Article 3 are what we call violation related. Here, the designations are typically within Section 3, and these are entities that, according to the EU's parlance, are facilitating infringements or otherwise frustrating the provisions of the circumvention prohibitions in the regulation. So here there is a EU nexus to the activity. These are entities or persons who are non-Russian, who are engaging in activity that effectively cause an EU entity to break the law unwittingly and unknowingly. So, for example, the most obvious example would be companies in Kazakhstan or China that are secretly exporting items from the European Union and then routing them to the Russian military.
Exactly. And I think just to visualize a bit how these designations are taking place under the regulation, I think on the one hand, as Jeff is explaining, direct ancillary sanctions do not have an EU nexus, and they've been targeting different actors. But Jeff has mentioned Belarusians, Iranians, and I see very wide-ranging reasons for these listings to take place. From Belarus, we saw high-ranking military officials and army personnel being designated for supporting Russia's war in Ukraine, for supervising the security of the border between Belarus and Ukraine. So really no real nexus to the EU, and this drove those designations, as well as entities transporting materials onto Russia. And with Iran, I think is a very clear example of how this tool is being deployed against third parties, where we saw 18 individuals and 8 entities, I think, in the case of Iran, that were designated under, I quote, Iran's defense cooperation with the Russian Federation, the supply of Iranian-made UAVs or unmanned aerial vehicles, so drones, for their use in Ukraine. So no EU nexus mention whatsoever. With violation-related ancillary listings, there is an EU nexus, but as we were discussing the expansion of the criteria in Article 3, Jan, I'm going to highlight a commentary that we did together, specifically looking into this criteria under provision 3H, as we're mentioning, these articles are getting very long, looking into this new criteria that allow for the targeting of third parties for facilitating infringements or significantly frustrating those provisions, as Jeff was explaining. And then the Council in the recital provided a bit of an understanding of what were indications of cases of frustrating EU sanctions. And they were very broad, just the fact that the main activity of the third country operator involved purchasing restricted goods in the EU that made their way to Russia, the involvement of Russian persons at any stages, the fact that the company was recently created and involved in these transactions. In the 15th package, we saw the designation of a Chinese business person and the entities under their control for exporting EU goods to a major Russian military industrial complex entity. And the arguments were, again, facilitating infringements of EU sanctions and thus additionally significantly frustrating EU sanctions. So there was not a very clear understanding of what was taking place beyond just merely re-exporting EU goods. So that was the territorial nexus to the EU, and hence the distinction between these two listings.
I got a really interesting footnote to this. I don't think we observed this in the paper, but as Gonzalo has pointed out, we haven't seen much practice under this authority yet. One fascinating thing I think to watch is whether or not the European Union will begin to use this authority in cases where the bad guys use the European Union's financial system to engage in activity in violation of the law, similar to what the U.S. does. We all know that using the U.S. dollar and the U.S. correspondent banking system is the main hook for an enforcement action against a non-U.S. party. And as we've discussed, the EU does not do that. So the question is then whether or not the European Union will begin to designate in cases where non-EU actors do nothing other than use the European Union's or their member states' financial systems in order to engage in activity in violation. I think that would be a really interesting thing to watch in the coming weeks, months, and years.
I'd like to come back to the notion of nexus for a little bit, and more specifically, the notion of EU nexus. Gonzalo, I think what you were highlighting is that, at least in some of the 269 ancillary listings, there is no apparent EU nexus in the conduct of the target. So when the 18 Iranian individuals and entities engage in activities in support of Russia's war effort, there isn't anything in that activity, or at least any explicit mention in the listing, in the statement of reasons, or otherwise in the public information about these designations that would suggest that they were facilitating, for instance, the export from the EU of materials to Iran or another third country and then passed on to Russia. It's the mere activity, the mere support, material support that these individuals and entities provided in support of the target, of the policy target of the sanctions, that is the justification for the listing. But from an EU sanctions jurisdiction perspective, I think what it means that the entities subject to EU law are prohibited from making funds or economic resources available to these individuals or entities or those that are owned or controlled by them. So would you see that there is a difference between the effect, or in terms of where the targets are beyond the EU, but they're not as such subject to EU law, of course, and their conduct doesn't necessarily require implication of EU nexus. However, those who are subject to EU jurisdiction now are prohibited from engaging with these in transactions with these entities and individuals who are beyond and outside the EU.
Exactly. So these third-party entities are engaging in trade that would be lawful under their own jurisdiction. They're not engaging with EU businesses and re-exporting EU goods onto Russia. According to the wording of the Council, taking the example of the Iran, we saw that these entities were producing Iranian-made drones and re-exporting them to Russia. To our knowledge, there's no involvement of EU technology in those drones. They have not facilitating any transactions with EU entities. So what the step that has taken is imposing full blocking asset sanctions on these entities, and then imposing a prohibition of engaging with them for EU operators. So it's a very real impact that they're having on third countries that are just operating under their own jurisdiction, but are undermining the aims of EU sanctions.
And Jeff, to your second observation, I think it will be very interesting because the EU directive on the harmonization of definitions and offenses for violations of EU sanctions has a clause on jurisdiction. And I think the clause on jurisdiction, which has to be implemented in all of the 27 member states, says that the legislation of all the 27 member states must allow for investigation of or prosecution of violations that have been committed in whole or in part on the territory of the Union. So in the future, could an EU investigatory or prosecuting authority take the view that a non-EU operator using the euro in a transaction otherwise not subject to EU jurisdiction or involving EU parties, because it is using the euro, it is causing an EU person or an EU financial institution to violate EU sanctions, and it is otherwise performing this transaction in part touching on EU territory and therefore is also subject to prosecution.
Absolutely. And I think that is the true, one of the many interesting, I think, questions that our paper can't resolve yet, because it's going to be determined based on practice. But how far will the EU go in this activity that occurs in whole or in part in terms of criminal enforcement? We know that at least in part, they have already, the European Union and the Council specifically has already used this instrument of the designation authority to go after parties that are getting prohibited items and moving into Russia. How far they go on the designation side, we don't know. That'll be fascinating to watch. And how far could they then in the future, putting aside ancillary listings, go on the enforcement front? It's a fascinating issue to be watching in the coming years with regard to the development of EU sanctions, both in the listing front and on the enforcement front.
And going back to the toolbox, we were discussing the tools under 269, the asset freeze related listings, but there are other tools, right, that qualify for ancillary listings.
We introduced the concept of indirect ancillary listings. They do not sit under the specific regulation. They have either been adopted under an existing geographic sanctions regime or under a new bespoke regulation that has been adopted um, for this new purpose with a direct connection to the original legal act and its mission. I think the clearest example would be the sanctions adopted against Iran under Council Regulation 2023-1529 in July 2023, where a number of entities and individuals were listed for supplying or selling UAVs to Russia to support its war of aggression in Ukraine, as well as other actors. It does go on to list groups in the Middle East and the Red Sea, as well as others that are breaching UN Security Council resolutions. In most of the, I think it's around 20 designations, 20 listings in this new regulation, most of them are linked to Russia. So we're seeing the repurposing of the Russian regime to introduce a separate legal act to target third parties with no EU nexus once again. So it's one step further in this direction. There are others, Russia-linked designations under the Belarusian or Syrian country regimes, and a lot of those designations were made because of the collaboration between Syrian government or Belarus officials with Russia's war in Ukraine, but they were tying those to supporting or benefiting from the Syrian or Belarusian regimes. We also saw designations related to North Korea's provision of ballistic missiles to Russia. Those are also, some of them within Regulation 269, but when placed under the specific regulation targeting North Korea, they are tied to a breach of UN sanctions. So they do couch them in pre-existing grounds, but the nexus to Russia is there.
The next bucket, I think, of ancillary listings that we identified are those that we call trade-related ancillary listings. What are those?
Those are effectively distinct from the three previous categories, not a full asset freeze. That's the one thing that sets them apart. What's fascinating about them is that they allow for, and this is where the European Union can get very creative in its sanctions practice, they allow for some other prohibition or restriction or ban short of a full asset freeze that can be targeted against the specific activity that undermines the efficacy of the EU sanctions. And here we've got several examples under 833. For example, there are bans on the export from the European Union directly or indirectly to persons, companies in multiple countries all over the world, China, UAE, Kazakhstan, so forth, Syria, of EU dual-use items or common high-priority items. Of course, this is to obviously curtail the circumvention of sanctions. And there's a policy decision to not designate these parties under the listing authorities we've talked about, but instead subject them to something less, as opposed to going all the way and subjecting them to an asset freeze. So that's possible, obviously, given the authorities that exist. We also see the transportation ban and the transaction ban, a really interesting one under 5AD. The transaction ban against banks who are and crypto providers who are facilitating transactions in violation of the sanctions regulations. Again, these could all be fully designated under the authorities we've discussed, but they're not. We've seen the Article 5S, I believe, or 3S, a vessel and port service ban on the shadow fleet, although now there's an authority to designate the shadow fleet separately under what we would call our direct ancillary listings. There are airport and aerospace bans on certain airlines, and you have the 5AC transactions bans that deal with banks. This is where we think the European Union, the Council, can get very creative, because you can do a lot less in full asset freezes and create a bespoke custom basis for subjecting companies or persons to certain prohibitions that are really specific to what's going on.
The argument has been made that this type of listings, those sitting under specifically Annex 4 of Regulation 833/2014, are not really sanctions. They are a trade restriction, but there's very real implications. Could you give us a legal perspective into why this category should be considered sanctions and not underplayed as a name and shame list?
They're sanctions because there are consequences. I agree that they're not obviously sanctions in that they're not a full asset freeze against the targeted parties, but there are parties who are targeted, named in a regulation, and there are restrictions placed on the ability of EU operators to deal with those parties. A name and shame list would mean that the party is just named and there are no consequences for the party being on the list other than just to shame them publicly. Here, there are real consequences for that party appearing on an annex relative to a particular article. And those, of course, are less than a full asset freeze and economic resource ban, but they still do prohibit European Union companies. Here, if an EU operator, for example, sends a dual-use item to one of the parties that we mentioned earlier under this category, the EU party can be penalized for doing that. If an EU party engages in a transaction with an asset freeze subject party, the EU party can be penalized for that. Where an EU party could be penalized for violating the prohibitions related to that listing is a sanction.
The transaction bans are very interesting because, in a way, there are listings. The system that is used is that of an annex. So under each relevant provision here of each individual transaction bans, there's an annex. Some of these annexes are empty. Others are very populated, like Annex 4. And if we take the example of non-EU financial institutions, if a non-EU financial institution is added to this annex, the consequence is that anyone subject to EU law must comply with the transaction ban and so cannot engage in any transaction directly or indirectly with that non-EU financial institution. And so the result or the effect of that from the perspective of the non-EU bank is that essentially you lose access to the EU market.
And I think the EU has been on quite a journey, particularly since February 2022. And I think it's time for the EU to really drive this capacity forward, especially in light of the growing US divergence, concerns on potential lifting by the US of sanctions against Russia. If the EU, the UK, G7 partners are going to lose US support and the very strong leverage of US secondary sanctions, the EU has to commit to this and ultimately deter third parties from breaching or undermining EU sanctions. So ancillary listings are a tool that is now within its toolkit, and it's time for the EU to really make use of it.
The European Union faces an existential crisis, a foreign policy related one, in that its conflict with Russia or the challenges it has with Russia go beyond Russia. The EU is at this precipice where, particularly given the possibility that the United States won't be there as it has in the past, or maybe there in different ways, we don't know where that's going to go. The EU is also facing a challenge in that it is going to have to move from a primary soft power to a hard power. And the EU is now at a challenge point, or as I mentioned, precipice, where it has to consider how much of a hard power it wants to be if it has to stand alone.
So in a scenario where the G7 plus coalition no longer benefits from the support, the input, the momentum from the US, the question would become whether the EU, now that it has an extensive toolbox, will be able to deploy these tools in support of its policy objectives. It's a remarkable development because there was a time in the 2022 sanctions where there was a fair amount of work done to find convergence on designations. And I think a lot of the commentators, practitioners, researchers were saying, well, we have a coalition, the G7 plus coalition. The coalition is creating convergence on the policy objectives. Within the coalition, you have autonomous legal regimes. There should be more coordination on the actions. And for some of the measures, it's almost harmonized, right? If you look at the price cap, for instance, or the diamond span, it's almost G7 plus law, so to speak, right? Because the degree of harmonization, substantively speaking, is very, very high. But there are lots of issues where what's binding, the bond within the coalition is the policy objective, and then there is different deference to the individual members to implement and carry out that objective, and the designations are used in very different ways. The UK has sanctioned individuals and entities that other regimes haven't. The US has sanctioned entire networks that haven't been sanctioned by the EU. But yet these pieces within the coalition were working together. And now that the EU, and one of the reasons the EU developed all of these instruments was because there was the convergence. You saw that for the vessels, the price cap,
the financial institutions actually was a G7 initiative. And now that there's this risk of erosion, or that this risk that the coalition, could lose, the US is going to place an even stronger pressure and create an even bigger challenge for the individual members, beginning with the EU, because it's the largest bloc, to use that power effectively. And so we shall see what role ancillary sanctions will play in that new landscape. Gonzalo, Jeff, always a pleasure. Thanks again for joining the program.
Thank you very much, Jan. It's been a pleasure.
This concludes this month's episode. If you've enjoyed the show, I hope you'll consider subscribing or writing a review on any platform you are used to. This Month in EU Sanctions is also a newsletter on LinkedIn. Links are available in the show's notes. Thank you for listening, and tune in soon for the next episode.